Do you guys remember that short that we released where there was like 17 different stacks pieces on the board by turn 4? Well, this is that pod. What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive. The game we have for you today is one of my favorites since we've come back, and it's a pod of full monocolored decks. And we kind of just so happen to pick monocolor decks that are either very stacksy or are very affected by stacks. And it made for a very, an interesting pod to say the least. We actually had to cut a commander from this pod. We originally had Yawgmoth Ran Physician in it, and that deck just got shut down by literally everything. So we swapped that out for Ashaya. But even with all that stacks, the game we have for you today is definitely one worth watching, and we definitely think you'll enjoy it. Remember, all of the deck list links are in the description, and if you do end up enjoying the video, feel free to give it a like, drop a comment down there for the algorithm, and subscribe if you're not already. With all that out of the way, let's introduce our players.
How's it going? My name's Bill, and today I'm playing Oswald Fiddlebender. The goal of the deck is to stacks out my opponents using effects like Uba Mask and Drannith Magistrate, and then to generate infinite mana using Rings of Brighthearth and Basalt Monolith to eventually filter that mana into a Goblin Cannon to infinitely damage my opponents.
My name's Jordan, and today I'm playing Ashaya Soul the Wild. This deck takes non-token creatures and turns them into forest lands. We use this to make infinite mana for Quirion Ranger, Scrib Ranger, something along those lines. Draw my deck, play Finale, or just overwhelm the board with big creatures and swing out with Craterhoof.
Hello everyone, it's Nate again. Today I'm playing my favorite commander, Urza Lord High Artificer. The point of this deck is to get infinite mana with either Power Scepter or a Power Artifact line, Hullbreaker Horror as an alternative option, and win that way.
What's going on, everybody? My name's Nate L, and I'm playing Godo Bandit Warlord. The idea behind this deck is to just pump out Godo, generate infinite combat steps, and slap your opponents through combat damage.
Bill goes first by playing an Ancient Then, and he then uses it to cast an Esper Sentinel. He then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan plays a Snow-Covered Forest as his land and taps it to cast a Carpet of Flowers. He then ships the turn on over to Nate B, who plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land, and he then taps it to cast a Mana Vault. He follows that up by casting a Chrome Mox for 0, and he imprints a Reality Shift when it enters the battlefield. With nothing left, he passes the turn. Nate L spends his turn playing a Snow-Covered Mountain and then shipping the turn off to Bill. Bill plays a War Room and then for 1 mana casts a Chromatic Star. He then for 1 mana sacrifices his Chromatic Star to generate a white mana and draw a card, and he then casts a Portable Hole. When it enters the battlefield, he gets Nate B's Mana Vault. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan plays a Snow-Covered Forest on his turn, and then ships the turn off to Nate B. Nate B starts and ends his turn by casting an Arkham's Astrolabe, not paying for Esper Sentinel. The turn is then passed to Nate L, who plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land, and then casts a Grim Monolith, not paying for Esper Sentinel. He then passes the turn off to Bill. Bill plays a Plains and plays a card that I think affects everybody at this table, Hushbringer. He then for 1 mana casts a Deafening Silence, and in response to this spell, Jordan casts a Natural State targeting Esper Sentinel, paying the extra cost. Bill, with no more non-creatures to cast on his turn, passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan gets a green mana from his Carpet of Flowers in his first main phase, and then plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He uses this to help cast his commander, Ashaya Soul of the Wild, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb, and he then passes the turn. Nate B goes to his turn and decides to show Jordan why everybody apparently hates Carpet of Flowers now, and decides to not play an island for turn, or any land for that matter, and just plays a Reality Chip and passes the turn. Nate L plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Wheel of Fortune. This wheel resolves, everybody discards their hand, draws a fresh 7, and having cast his 1 non-creature spell, Nate L passes the turn. Bill goes to his turn, plays an Urza Saga as his land, and then casts a Chalice of the Void, X equaling 1. Because people were still playing a little bit too much Magic, I guess. He then rounds out his turn by casting his commander, Oswald Fiddlebender, and the turn is then passed to Jordan. Jordan gets 1 green mana from his Carpet of Flowers in his first main phase, and then plays a Dryad Arbor as his land for turn. He then casts a Thorn of Amethyst, and I'll just tell you right now, strap in because this game doesn't get any better. He then goes to combat and swings 5 commander damage at Bill, and then passes the turn. Nate B on his turn plays a Seagate Reborn as his land for turn, paying 3 life to have it enter untapped, and he then casts an Ethereum Sculptor, which normally would be a combo piece, and now just kind of negates the Thorn of Amethyst and doesn't really help him win at this point, and he follows that up by casting a Mishra's Bauble. With nothing left, he passes to Nate L. Nate L plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land and taps for 3 mana to cast an Arcane Signet. With nothing left, he passes to Bill. Bill plays a Plains and then casts a Scrap Trawler. He then immediately activates his commander, sacrificing the Scrap Trawler to search up a Mystic Forge. The Mystic Forge enters the battlefield, and he then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan in his first main phase gets a single green mana from his Carpet of Flowers, and then hard casts an Elvish Spirit Guide, taking 2 damage from Ancient Tomb. If there was ever a play that described the tragic state that this game is in, it's this play right here. He then goes to combat and swings 6 more commander damage at Bill, and then passes the turn to Nate B. Nate plays an Academy Ruins as his land, and then casts his commander Urza Lord High Artificer, not getting a construct due to the Hushbringer. He then casts a Lotus Petal and sacrifices his Mistress Bauble, targeting Jordan to look at the top card of his library. With nothing left, he passes the turn. Nate L in his turn plays a Crystal Vein, and then for 9 mana, casts an Everflowing Chalice, kicked 4 times. He then goes to pass the turn to Bill, and on Nate L's end step, Bill activates his Mystic Forge to exile the top card of his library. Bill goes to his turn, and before he draws, he again activates his Mystic Forge, exiling the top card. He then continues on with his turn. The Urza Saga triggers, and he floats a colorless while tutoring up a Voltaic Key to the battlefield. He uses this newly acquired key to untap his Mystic Forge, and he then again activates Forge to exile the top card of his library. He then realizes there's just too many things that are usable this game and casts a Null Rod. In response to this, Nate L untaps his Grim Monolith, and then the Null Rod resolves, and Bill passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan in his first main phase gets a green mana from his Carpet of Flowers, and he then casts a Natural Order, sacrificing his Elvish Spirit Guide as an additional cost. He loses 2 life to the Ancient Tomb in order to cast this, and off of the cast he gets an Orin Frostfang. He then goes to combat and swings 6 damage at Bill, and when the combat damage is dealt, Jordan draws a card. Jordan then plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx before passing the turn to Nate B. Nate on his turn plays an Ancient Tomb, and then taps his mana to cast a Scroll Rack. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate L. Nate L plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land, and then casts a Heat Shimmer, targeting Jordan's commander, Ashaya. Nate L then goes to combat and swings 6 damage at Bill. Bill takes 6 more damage, and with nothing left, Nate L passes the turn. Bill goes to his turn, and in his first main phase, uses Oswald on Null Rod to search up a Foundry Inspector. He then activates his Mystic Forge to exile the top card of his library, and he then again untaps his Mystic Forge with his Voltaic Key, and then reactivates Mystic Forge, exiling another card. He then casts an Aethersworn Canonist, and with nothing left, passes to Jordan. Jordan gets 1 green mana from his Carpet of Flowers in his first main phase, and uses this to help cast a Regal Force, taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb. He then goes to combat and swings 1 damage at Nate and 8 at Bill. Bill chump blocks Ashaya, but still takes 2, and Nate takes the 1, so Jordan draws 2 cards. In his second main phase, he plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth as his land for turn, and he then goes to pass the turn, and on his end step, Nate B activates his Scroll Rack for 4. Nate B then goes to his turn, plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land, and then activates Urza. Urza's activation goes off, and he gets a land which he can't play since he's already played a land for turn. The land is exiled and gone forever, and Nate B then passes the turn. Nate L goes to his turn, plays an Emergence Zone as his land, and then casts a Cursed Mirror. Since it's an artifact, it gets around Hushbringer, and when Cursed Mirror enters the battlefield, he has it copy Ashaya. He then goes to combat and swings a 7/7 Ashaya at Bill, and Bill blocks it with his Hushbringer. Bill gains 1 life from the lifelink, and in his second main phase, Nate L casts Godo Bandit Warlord. In response to this, Nate B activates his Scroll Rack for 3, and then with no other responses, Godo enters the battlefield and triggers the ETB effect since Hushbringer is gone, and Godo gets a Helm of the Host to the battlefield. Nate L follows this up by casting an Imperial Recruiter, and when that enters the battlefield, he gets a Dire Fleet Daredevil. With nothing left and not a combat step to go to for his Helm combo, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill, in his upkeep before he draws, activates his Mystic Forge to exile a top card of his library. He then plays a Blink Moth Nexus as his land for turn, and he then activates his commander Oswald on the Chalice of the Void to search up a Sensei's Divining Top to the battlefield. He then activates his Voltaic Key to untap his Mystic Forge, and he again reactivates his Mystic Forge to exile the top card of his library. He then plays a Mana Crypt off the top of his library since he still hasn't technically cast a non-creature spell this turn, and he follows it up by casting a Phyrexian Revoker. When the Revoker enters the battlefield, he has it name Helm of the Host. He then activates his Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library, and he then recasts his Esper Sentinel. Bill then goes to pass the turn to Jordan, and on Bill's end step, Jordan casts a Worldly Tutor. In response to this Worldly Tutor, Nate B casts a Narset's Reversal, successfully bouncing the spell back to Jordan's hand, and searching up a Hullbreak Horror to the top of his own library. Jordan then goes to his turn and gets 2 green mana from his Carpet of Flowers. He then casts a Wild Growth and immediately goes to combat. He swings 11 total damage at Bill and 5 at Nate B. Bill blocks Ashaya and the rest of the damage goes through, and Jordan draws 2 cards. In his second main phase, Jordan activates his Nykthos for 9 total mana and uses this to help cast an Avenger of Zendikar. In response to this, Bill activates the Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library, and then the Avenger resolves, getting 9/0/1 plants to the battlefield. Jordan then plays a snow-covered forest as his land, pumping up all of his plants, and he then casts a Boreal Druid. And since Ashaya is out, Boreal Druid is also a forest, so that also pumps up the plants. With nothing left, Jordan passes to Nate B. Nate B starts off his turn by casting a Hullbreaker Horror. He takes 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb and then activates Scroll Rack for 2. He then decides to reconfigure his reality chip on Urza. He finishes off his turn by playing a snow-covered island and passing the turn to Nate L. Nate L begins his turn by casting a Direfleet Daredevil. When it enters the battlefield, he gets Natural State from Jordan's graveyard. He then casts Natural State, targeting the Phyrexian Revoker. It resolves, and then Nate goes to equip his Helm of the Host to Godo. In response to this equip, Jordan casts a Beast Within, targeting Godo. The Beast Within resolves, Godo is then destroyed, and Nate L, defeated and with nothing left to do, passes the turn to Bill. Bill goes to his turn, and before he draws, he uses his Mystic Forge to exile the top card of his library. He then, still before he draws, activates Voltaic Key to untap his Mystic Forge, and then retaps his Mystic Forge to exile another card. He then loses his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, finally goes to his draw step, draws a card for turn, and he then activates his Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library. He then taps his Divining Top to draw a card, plays a Plains as his land, and then overloads a Winds of Abandon. This resolves, Nate B gets 4 lands to his battlefield, Nate L gets 3, and Jordan gets 13. He actually had 14 triggers, but he only had 13 basic lands left in his library, so he only got 13. Bill then goes to his end step, and on his end step, Jordan casts Worldly Tutor. This time it resolves, and he searches up a Beast Whisperer to the top of his library. Jordan then goes to his turn, and in his first main phase, Carpet, now a useful card, makes 6 green mana. He uses this to help cast his Beast Whisperer, and he then recasts his Commander Ashaya, and when it enters the battlefield, he draws a card. He then plays a Windswept Heath as his land, and he then casts a Regrowth, targeting Worldly Tutor. When that resolves, he casually casts a Craterhoof Behemoth, and then goes to combat and swings 8 trample damage at Bill. Bill takes the damage and then loses the game. In his second main phase, Jordan takes 2 damage to activate his Nykthos, generating 7 green mana, and he then casts an Emerald Medallion, followed by a Utopia Sprawl, followed by a Sylvan Library. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate B. Nate B starts his turn by recasting his commander Urza. He then reconfigures his reality chip onto Urza again. He then casts Trail of Evidence, and with nothing left, passes to Nate L. Nate L starts his turn off by also casting his commander. For 8 mana, he casts Godo Bandit Warlord, and when it resolves and enters the battlefield, he gets a Hammer of Nazan to the battlefield. When Hammer of Nazan enters, it auto-equips to Godo, and then Nate moves to equip Helm of the Host to Godo. In response to this equip, Nate B saves the day by casting a Winds of Rebuke targeting Godo. Godo is then bounced, everybody mills 2 cards, and Nate L, with still some mana left, recasts Godo. It resolves again, and when it enters the battlefield, he gets Conqueror's Flail to the battlefield. With no more mana to equip, he goes to pass the turn, and on Nate L's end step, Jordan casts a Worldly Tutor. In response to this, Nate B casts Delay, successfully stopping the tutor. Jordan then goes to his turn, takes 8 damage from Sylvan Library to draw 2 additional cards, and in his first main phase gets 6 green mana from his Carpet of Flowers. He then casts a Shared Summons. Knowing that this is pretty much the end if it resolves, Nate B decides to crack one of his clue tokens in order to draw a card. Unfortunately, not finding anything, Shared Summons resolves, and Jordan gets a Priest of Titania and a Quirion Ranger to his hand. Jordan then casts this Priest of Titania, the Quirion Ranger, and a Concordant Crossroads to give it haste. At this point, Jordan has a pretty potent combo online. Jordan can return a forest to his hand to untap a target creature, and since all of his creatures are forests, he can return Quirion Ranger to his hand to untap Priest of Titania. And since Priest of Titania has haste from Concordant Crossroads, he's able to generate just enough mana to recast Quirion Ranger. And since Beast Whisperer is on the battlefield, every time he recasts this creature, he draws a card. So all he has to do is draw until he hits a few more elves, and he can essentially make as much mana as he wants. He also ends up drawing his entire library, and is able to cast any creature he wants, and then a Finale of Devastation for as much as he wants, giving him enough damage to take out his opponents and win the game.